Well, good evening. I'm glad to be here with you on this Good Friday evening, and to spend some time thinking with you and meditating with you about what the events of this day meant that we commemorate, and the death of the Lord Jesus, condemned to a Roman cross. Several years ago, I had a man, I actually had picked him up hitchhiking. And as the conversation turned to spiritual things, he told me that he had recently become a Christian, a follower of Jesus, that he hadn't grown up in the church and he really didn't understand his faith very well, but that he had committed himself to following Jesus. And so I asked him to come to my church, which he did for a couple of years before he moved away. And one time after the service, he asked me a question. It was a good question. He said, why is it that in the Christian creeds, in the historic Christian creeds, Pontius Pilate is immortalized? That the man was a scoundrel. He did what he knew to be wrong. Why is his name not rather forgotten? Why do we immortalize his name? And it was a good question. I think there's a simple biblical answer to that it just lays on the surface of the scriptures, and that answer is this, that we're told in the 13th chapter of the book of Romans that the governing authorities that exist have been ordained by God and that they're ministers of God. And passages like Isaiah chapter 10 indicate to us that that is true, whether or not those governments are good or just governments, whether they do what's right. That, in other words, whatever those governments do, they end up fulfilling the plan of God. That was so with Rome, and it was certainly so with the events that took place under Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea. And it was necessary that the judgment of heaven be reflected in the judgment that was rendered on earth. It would not have done for Jesus to die in an accident or to die at the hands of an angry mob, but he had to be judicially condemned. And so that is a significant thing, that Pontius Pilate was the lawful, the rightful judge of Judea, and Jesus was condemned judicially by that rightful and lawful judge. His death had to fulfill Deuteronomy 21:23, which says, "Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree." And that was the Roman method of execution for non-Roman citizens. All four of the Gospels record for us that Pilate knew Jesus to be innocent, but he condemned him anyway. And that reflects the judgment of heaven, that God, knowing that Jesus was innocent, nonetheless, as we're told in the 53rd chapter of the prophet Isaiah, that it pleased the Lord to crush him and to put him to grief. And we're also told in all four Gospels about a man by the name of Barabbas who took place in a rebellion and an insurrection. He would have likely been guilty of murder, who was known to be guilty, but was let go, and Jesus was condemned, as it were, in his place, fulfilling the idea that we find in Isaiah chapter 53, that his life was offered as a guilt offering, that the innocent was punished for the guilty. And that would be all that we would really need to know about the situation with Pilate to understand why the creeds immortalize his name. We have to know that Jesus was judicially condemned, that he was known to be innocent by the judge, but was condemned anyway, that the guilty was both charged and sentence carried out against him, the innocent in place of the guilty. Pilate is mentioned, however, in other works of antiquity. He's mentioned in the Jewish historian Josephus. He's mentioned in the Jewish apologist Philo of Alexandria, and he's mentioned in the Roman historian Tacitus. And to understand Pilate's actions and what led up to what took place that night, it's important for us to understand not only Pilate, but two other figures in history. Those two other figures are Tiberius Caesar and Lucius Sejanus. Now, Pilate was the fifth governor of Judea for Rome, and he held that post longer than any other Roman governor did. He held it for 10 years, from AD 26 to AD 36. Tiberius Caesar, of course, you know him as a Roman emperor. He was the second Roman emperor, the stepson of Augustus, who was the first emperor of Rome, and he reigned over the empire from AD 14 until his death in AD 37. Tiberius was an able administrator. He was a gifted and talented man, but Pliny the Elder called him the gloomiest of men. And after the death of his son Drusus, Tiberius became very withdrawn and just kind of got out of public life altogether. And he left Rome to be managed, to be administrated for him in the day-to-day decisions that were made by a fellow by the name of Lucius Sejanus. And Sejanus, when he was appointed to that post, began to consolidate power, and he purged the Senate and the wealthy equestrians of those people who were opposed to him, because he did have some political enemies, and he purged the Senate and those who had power, who had wealth, who were opposed to him, by charging them with disloyalty to Tiberius. Historians like Stauffer point out that at the time that Pontius Pilate was appointed to be governor of Judea, that Tiberius would be in this self-imposed seclusion at the time, and it would have been Sejanus who had approved and had appointed Pilate to that post, and that becomes important as the story unfolds. It's also important to understand that Judea was very important to Rome, because it was a trade hub for trading with the East, and Rome had a very robust trade with the East. Rome, in its imperial expansions, had wanted to actually push further east, but they were unable ever to conquer the Parthian Empire. But very interestingly, the Parthians at one point were able to take the city of Jerusalem. And that happened in 37 BC. And they actually took the city of Jerusalem, which was of great alarm to Rome for them to control now this trade hub. And so a man by the name of Herod, we know him in history as Herod the Great, went to Rome, offered to muster an army to drive the Parthians out, which he was successful in doing. And as a reward for that, Rome bestowed upon him the title of King of the Jews, made him King of Judea. Of course, he was a king in behalf of Rome, but he was powerful at that time. And that's the Herod that we know from the nativity stories of Jesus, that when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, we were told that Herod was on the throne. That's the Herod that was on the throne at the time. It was Herod the Great, who had recaptured Jerusalem from the Parthians. Historical sources indicate to us that Pilate had a very difficult time in governing Judea. He didn't really understand the culture. He didn't understand the religious sensitivities of the Jews very well, and so he was constantly running afoul of them. At times, running afoul of those sensitivities would bring things to the verge of riot, and on some occasions, Pilate had to put down those insurrections, those near insurrections, the verge of riot, put them down with force. And whenever that happened, Tiberius was not pleased with that because he knew how important Judea was, but he also knew how precarious the situation was there with the ungovernable Judeans being governed by the Romans. And on one occasion, when Pilate had offended the Jews and refused to change course because he was afraid it would offend Caesar, would offend Tiberius, Tiberius sent him an angry letter of reprimand, warning him sternly not to do anything that upset the Jews again. Now, there's one other piece of history that you have to understand, and that is what happened in AD 31, because in AD 31, the whole stage was set for what was going to unfold. In AD 31, Tiberius uncovered that Sejanus was not quite the friend and trusted lieutenant that he thought he was, that Sejanus, in fact, was plotting, perhaps through assassination, to take the empire for himself, to become the next Roman emperor. And what Tiberius did was he didn't reveal this, of course, to Sejanus, but he had a letter sent to the Senate when they were assembled, and Sejanus was there. It was a long and rambling letter, and at the end of that letter, he revealed that Sejanus was a traitor, that he was plotting to take the empire, and he ordered that Sejanus be arrested and executed immediately, which he was within a week. But not only was Sejanus executed, but his entire family was executed with him. And therein there were a number of arrests made of people who were known to be loyal to Sejanus, who were known to be friendly with Sejanus, and numbers of those people and their families were also executed. In fact, the historian Tacitus says that there were multitudes that were executed as being associated with Sejanus, and yet when that happened, Tacitus says that they were not mourned over, nor were their bodies recovered, because their loved ones were afraid that by being associated with them, they would be associated with Sejanus and suffer the same fate. And with that in mind, you need to recall that Pontius Pilate had been appointed to his post by Sejanus, that he had been reprimanded by Tiberius not to incite the Jews again. And you need to understand that background then to understand what we read in the gospel accounts. And I'm going to read tonight from John's gospel from chapters 18 and 19. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, the Jews did not enter the palace. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," the Jews objected. This happened so that the words Jesus had spoken, indicating the kind of death he was going to die, would be fulfilled. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "It was your people and your chief priests who handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest, but now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king, then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You are right in saying I am a king. In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" Pilate asked. With this, he went out again to the Jews and said, I find no basis for a charge against him. But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? And they shouted back, No, not him. Give us Barabbas. Now Barabbas had taken part in a rebellion. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, Hail, King of the Jews, and struck him on the face. And once more Pilate came out and said to the Jews, Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him. When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to him, Here is the man. As soon as the chief priests and the other officials saw him, they shouted, Crucify! But Pilate answered, You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him. The Jews insisted, We have a law, and according to that law he must die, because he claimed to be the Son of God. When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid and went back into the palace. Where do you come from? He asked Jesus, but Jesus gave him no answer. Do you refuse to speak to me? Pilate said, Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you? Jesus answered, You would have no power over me were it not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of greater sin. From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jews kept shouting, If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be king opposes Caesar. When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat, a place known as the stone pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of Passover week, about the 6th hour. Here is your king, Pilate said to the Jews, but they shouted, Take him away, crucify him. Shall I crucify your king? Pilate asked. We have no king but Caesar, the chief priests answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to be crucified. Pilate knew that Jesus was innocent, knew that he should release him. But here was Pilate's predicament. He knew that Jesus was innocent. He knew that he should be released, that was the principled thing to do. He also knew that if a rebellion broke out, if a riot broke out under Pilate's watch again, that he might lose more than his governorship. He might lose his life, and he might lose the lives of all of his family. And so Pilate made a choice. It was an evil choice. It was an unprincipled choice. And it was the same choice that you would have made if you were in his position. And it's the choice that I would have made. You see, my friends, Pilate is not worse than us. Pilate is us. It's our sin that put Jesus on the cross. But we focus our attention on the wrong thing tonight if we focus our attention on our sin. I want to leave you tonight with the hope that is found in Jesus' death. Another incident in Judea later that year would get Pilate recalled to Rome by Tiberius. That was an ominous thing. In God's providence, while Pilate was traveling to Rome, on his way to Rome, Tiberius died. And as was often the case in the change of succession in Rome, the new governor, Gaius Caligula, seems to simply have just dismissed any leftover legal matters from the previous reign. And at that point, Pontius Pilate disappears from history. The historians who lived contemporaneously with him don't speak of him anymore. And we're left simply with tradition. The writer Eusebius says that Pontius Pilate committed suicide, but Origen disputes that. And none of the historians who were contemporaneous with Pilate, Josephus or Philo or Tacitus, mention anything about his suicide. There's a sub-tradition within the Christian church. It's the tradition of the Coptic and the Ethiopic churches. And that tradition says this, that Pontius Pilate, after that time, simply went into retirement. And he reflected on that time that he'd been governor of Judea and the things that had taken place. And there were stirrings around the empire, rumors about this Jesus of Nazareth having been the Son of God and having risen from the dead. And the Coptic and the Ethiopic churches and their tradition maintain that Pontius Pilate repented of his sin and became a disciple of Jesus, became a follower of Jesus, became a Christian. And you know, friends, I don't think that that's beyond the pale of possibility to have happened. And if there's hope for Pontius Pilate, there's hope for you and for me. And hope is why Jesus came. Hope is why Jesus died. So I want to encourage you tonight to spend some time this evening on this Good Friday, reflecting on these things, reflecting on that passage in the Gospel of John that I've read, spending some time in prayer, maybe some time discussing these things with your family. May God bless you and keep you tonight, watch over you and keep you safe until we meet together via the internet on Sunday morning to mark and to celebrate the resurrection of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ.